Okay, joining us now on the morning show is Adetilewa Adebajo, Chief Executive Officer, CFG Advisory. Good morning to you. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Right, so many issues to dissect this morning. Oh, maybe let's just start with an outlook. What are your initial takeaways from these projections, proposals that have been shared concerning 2025's budget?
Okay, I think first of all, I think we need to understand that there's a process to the budget, and this is part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and the process involves submitting a medium-term expenditure framework to support the budget. So what is important, first of all, the first question we need to ask is, what has been the performance of the 2024 budget? As you know, there was a supplementary budget also this year, and we had several budgets running at the same time. So it's time now to consolidate all these budgets and now close some of the other budgets and now focus on a new budget for 2025. Because we need to understand what the impact of the reforms are, to understand what that performance is, and that's the information that I think the Minister of Budget and Planning needs to provide now. Because if you take a look at last year's medium-term expenditure framework, they were off on all the targets. They were projecting 700 naira, for instance, for exchange rates, and a lot of all those projections for the next 3 years were far off targets. And as you can see, we had a deficit of 13 trillion from 2023. About 13 trillion from 2022, which we carried over to 2024. And the deficit this year was projected at about 10 trillion. Now with the supplementary budget, that deficit should be close to about 18 trillion. So we have significant challenges in terms of deficit financing. And now with this huge budget, the question now is, what revenues do we have in place to finance this budget? How are we going to raise the revenues to finance this budget? Because traditionally, we've only been able to meet 65 to 70% of our revenue targets. So there are serious challenges on the revenue side. So those are the questions that are still unanswered. So I think it's important that we review this year's budget performance, and then we now begin to understand the details of this budget for next year, because the key question is, how are you going to finance this budget? So that's really where the challenge is.
Let's think, was there a need for a 7.5 trillion budget, which we know that maybe once it goes to the National Assembly, they will also do their padding and bloating and all of that, and maybe this might probably top 50 trillion. Was there a need for a 50 trillion at a time where we are starved of revenue?
Well, this is where the challenge is, and that's why I said we need to take a look at the performance. What is the impact? What has been the impact of the 2024 budget? Because for this administration, this was their first budget. And it's important for us to analyze the impact of this budget on the economy, where we are, especially with the reform programs and all that. Because as you see, the finance minister also talked about raising another $2.2 billion in external debt financing. And so 1.7 billion of that was going to come from a Eurobond, and about another 500 billion from a Sukuk type of a program. So the challenge you have with that is that in the last 1 year or so, our domestic debt profile has moved from 50 trillion naira to about 70 trillion naira. So we've put in about 20 trillion naira on the debt profile. That's nearly 50% of the existing debt. So that's pretty significant. So on the foreign debt side, it's stabilized at about $41 billion. So with these new borrowings and other borrowings, maybe by the end of this year, we should look at our external debt borrowing close to about $45 billion US dollars. And it's becoming unsustainable. And the reason why is that our credit rating is still Caa1, although the outlook is positive, but that means that these bonds are non-investment grade, which you call junk bonds. So clearly that is why the premium we're paying on financing is in double digits. So we're paying between 9 to 12, 13% on our bonds. So that is quite expensive, especially in an era where rates are being cut where you take a look at the benchmark dollar prices being cut. So there are challenges there that we have to address because we are now, the economy is still in stagflation. We need to go back to address the issues with petroleum pricing once and for all because it's causing a lot of distortions in the economy. This issue with the Dangote refinery, the price of petroleum products needs to be resolved. The foreign exchange system seems to have stabilized and we now have a NAFEM system. But if you recall, last year, the central bank governor in a speech at the Chartered Institute of Bankers stated that they were going to create a new foreign exchange system which was going to be backed by legislation. So we will need some clarity from the central bank governor if the NAFEM system is now the preferred one, and the proposals from last year have events overtaking that. So we need that clarity. But at least we have the stability in terms of the foreign exchange market, and we have a lot of the international money transfer operators who have been assimilated into the system, and we have some sort of amnesty to get people to put money back into their domiciliary accounts. So, but the essence is that the subsidy removal, which we talked about, the foreign exchange liberalization, which was the highlight of the reform programs, if the subsidy is no longer there, we haven't seen the commensurate increase in the revenues of government. And again, with this talk of increasing oil production to 1.8 billion barrels a day, then we need to see that reflected in the foreign reserves, and we need to see a more transparent federation account operation system, which these oil revenues are going into, and of course, eventually that will also be reflected eventually in the level of our reserves. So if you're at 1.8 million barrels a day, your reserves should be at least $45 billion. So that is not yet reflected. So until we get to that stage, we're there. But we are definitely in a critical stage right now.
The Minister, Atiku Bagudu, said that one of the reasons for this budget being so much bigger is because they're going to be allocating some funding to the developmental commissions that have just been created. Do you see that matching up first of all, does this model work? Is it sustainable for, the budget to now be, providing for these development commissions? And secondly, does this justify the jump that we're seeing in the increase in the budget?
Well, for me, what is important is that if you cannot fund your budget, you cannot budget for what you cannot finance. And I think if you continue to do that, you're just going to continue to carry over deficits. Because it is clear now from the numbers we're seeing that a lot of this budget could not have been 100% implemented because they couldn't raise the financing even to do the deficit financing. But the danger we're facing is the fact that if you take a look at all these expenditures and programs, there's supposed to be a goal. So why do you do a budget that you cannot finance or you do not have the revenues? So what are the revenue numbers? What had the revenues number? The revenues for 2024 was projected at about 17 trillion. Okay, you do a budget of 17 trillion and you're constantly doing 50%. So your revenues will be 50% and your budget will be twice that. Okay, so basically you are always looking at financing half of your budget. This is not sustainable. So, but even then, where is the impact? Okay, because the questions you're going to ask now, we're going to start asking from the central bank, is going to be very simple. The central bank has done close to a 900 basis point increase in interest rates in MPR since the beginning of this year, February, in an effort to control inflation. Okay, so it's going to be a year in February. And what you find out is the fact that instead of inflation coming down, we find out that inflation trajectory is on the way up. So the central bank has gone through significant tightening. It has done about 7 trillion in open market operations in the last 9 months. CRR has been increased to 50%. So basically, you're squeezing the economy. And the government expenditure, the money supply has hit a record high of 100 trillion. And you are not seeing any results in decline in inflation. When we saw the decline in inflation in trajectory, all of a sudden, that is why I said this fuel price situation is back up. So all of a sudden, you now come back with another pricing on the fuel. Then, of course, inflation comes back. So it's a zero-sum game. So if you do not sort out these issues with Dangote and the IPAMs and the Chapmans and all those marketing agencies, you need to have some sort of resolution. Petroleum pricing is based on Platts prices on an international markets. You can go on the internet and you will see the price of PMS on international Platts prices. So it's that benchmark we all need to adopt. And depending on the direction of oil prices, then, pump prices will adjust accordingly. So we do have significant challenges that we need to address because right now, the reform process is in a fatigue and we're in an economic quagmire.
The foreign exchange, depending at 1,400, Fitch was saying the other day that in the next 2-3 years it can go up to 1,900. Is that feasible? Also, they pegged $75 per barrel at a time which we expect that since if Trump comes in, America is going to do a lot of pumping. Some analysts are saying it can go as less as $60 per barrel. Is that also feasible? That's another point. The third point will be about, revenues, like you said, vis-a-vis, what we spend on our budget. Can't we just, as a nation, let me use the very funny Yoruba phrase, Shebuti moelewa shapu. What it means invariably is that cut your coat according to your cloth. If we projected revenue of 15 trillion, for instance, have a budget around that revenue projection and make it effective. Because like I was saying this morning, the case of padding also comes in. This large budget cycle, Ningi did point out that budgets did do extensive work and discovered that close to 2 trillion was padded in that budget. So there's also the caveat for padding. And that's why we don't see the effectiveness of that budget like you're talking about.
Well, let's address these issues you raised about. My main concern with the medium term, you see, what is very important is that, like I've told you, there's certain financial circuit breakers. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is a significant act that guides fiscal management. There's also the Debt Management Office, and there's also Section 38 within the CBN Act. Now, these are financial circuit breakers that is supposed to help with fiscal management. And what a lot of people also don't know is that there's a Fiscal Responsibility Commission. Now, unfortunately, this commission does not have a voice. This is where my concern is, because the Fiscal Responsibility Commission is supposed to be voicing out a lot of all these things and getting things done. But if you take a look at the strategy paper that was done last year from the medium term, because what you need to look at from the government is to take a look at their medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy papers, they're off. All those projections are off completely. It's very unrealistic. It's not close to reality. That is my concern. Because if you budget based on this, and we are now in 2024, we look at that. At the beginning of the year, remember that we put together a guidance on the foreign exchange, which was correct today. Now we have changed that forward guidance to between 1,800 to 2,100. And we're telling a lot of our own investors and clients that when you're budgeting next year, you should budget with 2,000.
Wow.
Okay, and to be able to maintain your value. And the reason why is not far-fetched, because we still feel that inflationary pressures are going to be there and is going to persist. You are also looking at the fact that government expenditure is going to be there. Deficit financing is still going to be there. Now, while the government does have headroom on borrowing, you see, the essence is the fact that you need to be able to get your revenue model. And like I've said before, when we talked about this NNPC balance sheet, if you take a look at the assets and the liabilities of the federal government of Nigeria, and you approach any bank, that is why we have a rating that is not investment grade.
Junk status.
It's junk bond. So the reason why is that your liabilities profile is not commensurate. So what you need to do, like I've said, is that we need to sell down these JV assets. By selling down these JV assets, we can raise 50 billion. And that's what you do. You restructure your balance sheet as government. You cannot continue deficit financing. It's not possible. You need to sell down some assets. You need to raise the $50 billion in cash, and you need to pump it to reduce your debt profile, and you need to increase the efficiency of the NNPC.
So I want to get something right. CFG Advisory is telling its clients and investors hedge for about 2,000 next year.
Yes.
Dollar to the naira.
Yes.
And the government is saying 1,400 according to their budget benchmark.
Well, what is the rate today in the markets?
This is about 1,700.
1,750.
So it goes back to the point of the parameters, like you said, and when you also look at the MTEF, are really off. And it goes back to the conversation about the government not being serious to be able to address its problems. Like, I'm happy you raised the case of the NNPC again. Also in those NNPC books, we saw that there were moribund refineries that we spent over 4 trillion naira on. Till today, we've not been able to hear the last of the Port Harcourt refinery. Nobody has told us when the refinery is going to start. We expended over $2 billion on that. And we keep hovering around in circle. Why are we not going to have accountability? Why, for instance, is that Fiscal Responsibility Commission not going to come up and say, you cannot do this, like it's done in other climes? That Fiscal Responsibility Commission is like the OBR in England. That pretty much is a stopgap, that you can't go beyond this if your fiscal responsibility is in tatters. But nobody wants to be accountable in this country.
Well, I think it goes beyond accountability, because don't forget that we have another MPC coming up now. And so what is the challenge for the central bank now with the rising rates of inflation? Are you going to have another rate hike?
Probably they
will.
won't.
For the year end. If you take a look at the whole essence of money supply is at 100 trillion. So what do you expect the central bank to do? So what we would have thought was the fact that that tightening that started in February, that by first quarter of next year would have begun to see a downward trajectory on inflation. But because we have put the cart before the horse and there's no synchronization with the management of the economy, we're having challenges that we're going to face.
How has this tightening affected your clients and investors?
Well, the pensioners are having a good time because interest rates are high. So
but the investors, the real people that put a lot of verve in the economy, that put investments, how are they feeling?
A lot of people are happy because the savers are happy because
I'm talking about the real investors in the economy,
the manufacturers
who
want to borrow money for working capital are complaining because interest rates are high. So there's a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. That's why you never have a one-handed economist. You can't, it's difficult. Most economists are one-handed. It's on one side is this, on the other. So it's a give and take. So the essence is the fact that you see what happened in the States. It was systematic. Inflation hit 9%, and they went through 2 years of tightening. And at the end of the day, they brought down, now that inflation has come down, they've cut rates twice in succession. So now that is going to create the stimulus for growth. So, but here, we're now in a dilemma. Because you see, right now, we would have thought that by February next year, things would have eased off and the central bank can start cutting rates. But with this budget, which is definitely an inflationary budget, you're going to have those challenges.
Have you done the numbers like the percentage, it's going to add to this budget, this budget. Have you done the numbers, probably numbers of how much inflation is going to add to the budget? It's going to add to the economy? Well,
it's too early to say because those are not the drivers. The key drivers of inflation right now is the fuel price. That's really the key driver.
But Dangote said he sorted that out with the...
Well, it's going to take a while.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm glad you're talking about growth figures because the assumption is that the economy is going to grow. I believe they added about maybe 2%, almost 2% of growth for next year. But beyond that, the Eurobonds, of course, have become very popular with African governments. But what are the real effects? Because, of course, the concern there with exchange rate volatility and so forth is the exposure that puts us to with regards to shocks and so forth. So I'd love to know the direct impact of going back to the Eurobonds and the Sukuk bonds as well, is that a model you're worried about? Or?
No, not really. Not really, because from what the finance minister said, the debt, the portion of the revenues that go towards debt service has improved significantly. So they do have some headroom, but the question is that you do not borrow for the sake of borrowing. My own concern about borrowing is how do you apply that borrowing? So the question now is that, you know, if go back to one of my favorite subjects, which is ways and means, you have 33 trillion in ways and means. So you can understand this budget is 48. For how much is this budget?
47.9.
47.8. For 48 trillion, let's say. And ways and means was 35 trillion. So you can see the impact of ways and means. The size of the ways and means was even bigger than last year's budget. Yeah. So when you have that kind of borrowings outside, then it's difficult. You're choking the economy. So my concern, like I've said before, is the fact that the federal government is not more so the borrowing, but the federal government is crowding out the private sector when it comes to financing. Because you not only have 50% CRR, you're tightening, you're increasing interest rates, and you are the only one that has the capacity to borrow in the system. Yeah. And people want to borrow because people want to invest in your bonds because they're high yielding. So you have that situation right now. So we need to correct that. So the problem is you're starving the private sector. The government is crowding out the private sector from funding. So those manufacturers, the SMEs, so you're going to stifle growth. And that's why we're still in stagflation. So you see, the central bank has some significant challenges next year when it comes to interest rates. And it will be interesting to see how the MPC is going to react. So my own suggestion is that we need to go back to the drawing board and we need to take a look at how we're going to manage a lot of all these issues. We need to sell down assets. So the solution now, we've gotten to a stage now whereby we need to sell down assets and raise 50 billion to be able to restructure the government balance sheet and put the government financing on a state of sustainability. That's the only way out as I see it now.
Okay. Everybody have questions?
Yeah, no, I believe we have to round up. Yeah.
We have to round up, but before we go, please, I want your verdict on something. You know you are the Mr. Ways and Means. In the presidential speech, he said, and I quote, "We have cleared Ways and Means." Have we?
No, we haven't cleared Ways and Means. I think we understand that Ways and Means, from the central bank numbers we see, Ways and Means is still at 32 trillion.
Okay.
And the challenge the central bank has now is that the securitization of Ways and Means is illegal.
Okay.
So Ways, in order for the government to pay off the central bank, they need to raise 33 trillion in cash.
Good.
And fund the central bank's account. The central bank cannot accept securitization as a means of repayment for Ways and Means.
So that means we have not cleared Ways and Means.
No, it's still it's good to, if you check the central bank website and you check the numbers there, it's pretty much clear. It's intact there.
Thank you. Very good.